Willkommen in einem anderen Aufregens Video. Welcome to another exciting video, in this case episode 57, my game system design series. In this video I'll discuss scenario design, which is a topic I have covered at different levels many times in the past, but not at a very high level. And instead, in the past, I specifically was focusing on micro armor only. As I'm now working on Napoleonics and ancient rules, I'm beginning to think more about scenario victory conditions for these periods, as many of the tricks I use for micro armor victory conditions do not work with Napoleonics and ancient figure gaming. Scenarios can be grouped into historical recreations and abstract games, which could range from evenly balanced forces meeting each other to something more nuanced, but with the overall scale being equal or possessing some standard ratio over the length of the game. I'll not deal with historical scenarios in this video in any detail, but the basic findings do apply to them as well. The only difference is players have some basic understanding of what each side did and generally follow those actions, or the victory conditions take into account the strategic situation based around the historical situation. Examples could be one side must attack and defeat the enemy because strategically they were cut off and needed to break through in order to survive, and this would influence victory conditions. When we look at abstract scenarios, the most basic one is equal forces meeting each other. This is very common in ancients and rather common in Napoleonics, but rare in World War II or moderns these days, especially if you want to have a reasonably good game. This type of scenario has fallen out of favour in the World War II modern period because they often result in a very boring game. Instead, some form of uneven game is forced, or, as occurs in Spearhead, not all forces are initially deployed, so the overall forces can be equal, but at any point in time there is an unbalanced situation. The reason is simple: a force attacking will always fail against an equal force. Thus, the first player to attack will lose, and the result is no one attacks if you have an even battle. Looking at ancients, the equal meeting engagement is the most common type of game. Rules such as Sabin's Lost Battles focuses on historical conflicts, but this is the exception among most ancient rules. Players who would use DBMM would use army lists to create equal points-based armies and take to the field. Originally I thought this was due to the technology, minimal missile fire and quick hand-to-hand conflicts, but I suspect it's more to do with the rules being used than anything unique with the period. DBMM, DBM, and especially DBA are all element maneuver sets of rules, where the way you maneuver your elements is critical to defeat or victory. There are other factors such as different element types, which give you a paper, scissors, stone effect, but DBN achieves the same and the troop type range is minimal. Element maneuver games are similar to chess and lend themselves to two equal forces battling it out. For World War II or modern element maneuver games are only possible if you're playing a skirmish squad or at a stretch some platoon scale rules, but are mainly present in skirmish rules. This is why skirmish and squad scale rules can have two equal forces battling it out, although I have to admit it works better for skirmish. Even with the squad scale, that is each element is a squad, it can become very difficult to get a good game if both forces are equal. A good indication that the World War II or modern rules that you're using are element maneuver rules is if armoured elements have specific flank armour values, which means the designers expect players to manoeuvre around to hit the flank of a tank in order to destroy it easier. Generic flank rules are very different, although this could encourage manoeuvring to the flank of a target for a win, but that is more the exception than the rule. Element density is a critical factor for World War II and modern rules. If the density is very low, then you could expect an element maneuver game to work. If the element density is high, then this is not a common way to win, and victory requires you to punch through a defensive line, in which case the even battle doesn't quite work very well. Napoleonic rules are in a strange middle ground. While it's very possible to have an element maneuver situation, as occurs with DBN and to a lesser extent WRG, the trends these days is for rules to avoid an element maneuver type situation. However, like ancients, element maneuver games between equal Napoleonic forces were very common or a very common type of game in the early period of the Napoleonic gaming area, as long as you use a set of rules which accommodates this type of game. DBN is a good example of such a rule, and as long as the element density is low enough, WRG rules also fits in this zone. The weapon systems which make it hard to have an element maneuver game at a higher density is artillery. There is another factor you need to consider when players are not particularly experienced, which is the rock, scissor and paper effect. This is very common in Ancients, with pike defeating all before it until it meets legionnaires, for example. This only has a negative effect when players are inexperienced or unfamiliar with the troop types. Once players are experienced, it has minimal effect to drive this maneuver element type situation. Nonetheless, it can take many games before a player gains the required experience, thus allowing players to have the equal conflicts with minimal element maneuvering work. Where we have an issue with Napoleonics is that when we move to Napoleonics, the troop types reduce dramatically, and most players understand these troop types' strengths and weaknesses. In the World War II modern period, the situation, while more complex, is similar. The number of games players have until they learn that infantry in the open gets slaughtered by tanks is not many games, if any at all, for those who understand history. As a result, I'll ignore this effect in my discussion of scenarios. So far we've discussed the chess type rules, the element maneuver games, which allow you to have equal forces battling it out. So what is the opposite of this chess-like element maneuver game? I don't have a good name for it, but I like to call it a formation maneuver game. Players spend their time deploying their elements or formations in order to attack or defend, and if attacking, when they are ready, they move a large body of elements in some form of formation forward. There is minimal individual element maneuvering. Instead, a formation is moved forward with some minor positional changes as it moves forward, and then contacts a number of enemy elements or formations. Then some form of, modestly complex in some cases, process is followed to determine if the entire formation wins or loses, affecting all elements involved. This type of restricted forward movement into contact with the element was achieved, initially at least, by the concept of a charge, with many Ancients and Napoleonic rules employing this concept. Of course, even in this case, there was a lot of careful angling to ensure a flank was contacted, although in more modern rules that was minimized with special rules, which eventually eliminated the old charge rules entirely. The main difference that occurs today compared with the past was the size of the formation conducting the close into contact. In older rules, these were normally formal units consisting of maybe 3 to 6 elements. Today, rules use the concept of big bases containing a number of elements, and in some cases combining the movement of more than one big base. In some rules, they can comprise of any collection of elements which happens to be in base-to-base contact with each other. When the formation size was small, you could still end up with that kind of element maneuver game, but if the formation size was large, this was pretty much impossible. The ideal element maneuver scenario is the scenarios contained in DBA. Each side gets a standard force mix consisting of 12 elements each. Terrain is deployed based on a system based on the army list selected and the forces meeting. The winner is the last man standing based on losses, with some extra ways of winning concerning camps. In simple, short and complete. This is only suitable for rules which are pure element maneuver rules. I must admit DBM and DBMM does a good job as well, even though the force mixes are much larger, but in these cases they are still fundamentally element-centric rules. The same system could be used for rules such as WRG Napoleonics, Ancients or similar, which combine element and formation maneuver. The issue is the troop density needs to be reasonably low, otherwise players quickly realise the best ways to win is to avoid losing elements. WRG Napoleonics does a good job using their army lists as long as players stick to the army lists and keep their force mix down to a maximum of 50 elements. In that case you get a reasonable result. However, it does take a lot longer to play this kind of game. Now we start getting into problems. When victory requires a side to launch a full-scale attack somewhere and you don't have the ability to win by manoeuvring your elements into that special angle to get the advantage, you start to realise the first person to launch an attack will lose, or at least has a high chance of a loss. you need to have a reasonable superiority along some part of the front line, perhaps 20 to 30 centimetres wide. While it's true you can try and manoeuvre your elements in a manner which allows you to achieve this, your opponent has a bird's eye view of the battlefield, so he can always respond and prevent this from achieving your objective. The result, in an even battle, any major attack is conducted with minimal advantage. An attacker will always suffer defensive fire, although may benefit from a charge bonus. In Ancients this may not be an issue unless facing samurai or Indian longbow, but in Napoleonics you need to expect musket fire at least. Once in hand-to-hand combat, even if there was no effect from enemy missile fire, it's a 50-50 situation. Depending on the game, this could result in a mass of units interspace with each other, as occurred in older rules, or the whole defensive line withdrawing, or the attacker being repulsed. Generally, it's less than a 50-50 situation for the attacker, but even if the result is a draw of some description, the attacker will almost certainly suffer greater casualties. The result is the defender now becomes the winner, and just needs to stay put in order to win the game. Blucher overcomes this by hiding the units until they're visible. Thus it's possible to achieve an advantage, and once you can see this, you can drive into attack. If you fail, then that's it. However, even in Blucher, the defender can sometimes take up a good defensive position and refuse to move. Although I must admit, Blucher, as long as you use historical scenarios which are asymmetrical type scenarios, you don't really have a big problem. I'm just using it as an extreme example in this particular video of this problem. In conclusion, the rules need to force a player to attack. Rules such as Spearhead forces an attack through the use of orders, which it does rather well. Spearhead does need the reserve concept to avoid a player basically losing a game on game turn 1 once the orders and positions are disclosed, which I must admit works extremely well. Other rules use orders to force attack without the reserve concept, and if the attacker discovers he has made a major mistake, the game then consists of the attacker fighting the game system to minimize his mistake. This may work, but gives you an awful game. Another method to drive players to attack is to use objectives. While objectives are often very gamey in World War II and modern rules, with a single jeep shooting out on the last game to take an objective, in Ancients or Napoleonics it's considerably more viable. Some ancient rules assume losing the camp results in an immediate loss. Thus, there is a reason for a side to defend its army camp. Some rules use the concept of a critical area of the battlefield, which gives its army some special advantage, as occurs with lost battles. Napoleonics would not use the army camps, but may use towns or bridges as an objective to hold, although that wouldn't automatically result in a loss or a win, but may be used for victory points conditions. I do remember in a board game, the SPI board game Marengo, which I played at least 100 times in competition play, had to include a list of objectives to force the Austrians to advance. Objectives do work, but the issue with figure gaming is defining what holding an objective represents. If you can define this, this is a good method to force an attacker to attack. Aligned with objectives is control of territory. In a game played on 30 centimetre tiles, or square centimetre tiles, this is reasonably easy to define, perhaps determined by the number of elements in a tile. In World War II moderns, only in-supply elements would be counted, thus giving an attacker a real reason to try and cut off an enemy front line in order to gain victory points. The lost battle system defines the centre of a battlefield as key squares, control of which gives your army some special benefit. This is not specifically to do with victory conditions, but achieves the same thing. It gives a player the incentive to take and hold something. The final is losses, which I normally do not like using for victory conditions purposes. In World War II or modern rules, losses should never be used for victory points purposes, as it encourages too much caution. However, for Napoleonics and Ancients, it could be used, although I personally do not like using it. While I do not normally like using losses for victory points, using them to trigger the end of an Ancients or Napoleonic game is reasonable. In many ways, this should be a mandatory requirement, as few armies could take high losses without retreating. I got that idea from Blucher, and after thinking about it for a while, many Napoleonic battles ended with one side retreating. The issue is what triggers the retreat. Losses is a reasonable trigger. Designers need a bit more though, as heavy losses may be acceptable if you know reinforcements are on their way, or if leadership is good, or if morale is good, etc. Consequently, the opposite may be also the case. Victory levels could be determined based on when this occurs. My conclusion is for World War II and moderns, the optimal victory conditions should be based on objectives and territory control. These would be manipulated in such a manner to force a player to do something, otherwise they would lose, thus requiring an attack if you're the attacker. The other requirement, which I feel is critical, is the force mix must be unbalanced, as forcing someone to attack to win will not work if their entire force is eliminated. 2-to-1 is about the most you should aim for deep playing areas, and ratios of 1.5-to-1 are optimal for shallower playing areas. In terms of Napoleonics, I'm uncertain what the best option is here, but I do feel unbalanced forces with reinforcements are required, coupled with this some form of retreat trigger based on losses and influenced by commander and troop quality. Of course, with a set of rules such as DBN, which is an element maneuver set of rules, the victory conditions in the rules are optimal. When we swing over with ancients, the issue with ancients are that there will rarely be reinforcements, so each side needs to slug it out until the trigger for retreat or rout is reached and the game ends. Taking an opposing army camp could trigger a retreat, as well as losses, but I'm uncertain what other victory conditions should be considered. In conclusion, victory conditions depend on the rules being used and the period being covered. Victory conditions can be used to force activity in the game which would otherwise not occur. Ill thought out victory conditions can cause a game to descend into a very boring affair. In order to get a good game which ends with a victor, victory conditions are critical, and often designers do not spend the effort required to get this element of the rules correct. This ends my diatribe on scenario victory conditions, which I must admit is a topic which has vexed me for years. This video does not solve the issue and is an attempt to identify the issues or individual issues which need to be resolved and a possible path to a resolution. I have no doubt I will have additional ideas in this area as I study new sets of rules, which may present new and innovative solutions to this issue. And so we come to the end of this video, or concludes episode 57 of my video on micro armor game system design, in this case discussing scenario design considerations. Alle guten Dinge, kommen zu einem Ende.